Thank you. Happy Wednesday and welcome everyone to the third talk this month in our Reef Rendez-VIEW series. Hopefully you've joined in on the other things that are taking place through our West Maui CP website. Liz and our conservation groups have been pumping out all sorts of fascinating and educational information, also fun. So I hope you've spent some time on Facebook. It's not too late to join our scavenger hunt. And we certainly expect you to sign up for our quiz night on the 30th of this month. Form a team or come and we'll put you on one. It'll be fun. There's prizes to be won. And really, you don't have to be an expert on anything. Just be a person on the planet and you'll do well. If you love Liz Foot's dark humor the way we all do, you won't want to miss it because there'll definitely be some of that included. So before we get on to our talk here, I'm just going to punt it over to Liz, who's managing the technical logistics of our talk tonight, to let you know how to navigate if you're having issues. Liz?
Great, thanks, Toba. And yes, I'm literally admitting everyone as we speak to join us. So I'm the tech person. Please keep yourself muted. More people are joining. If you have any issues with bandwidth or things like that, best thing is to turn off your video. If you have any issues in general, feel free to send me a message in the chat box. You can feel free to type in there. You can make it private to me or not. It doesn't really matter. And one thing I'm going to point out is that we are planning to have some time at the end for questions and answers. So you can use the chat box for that too. So feel free to type in any questions right into the chat box and we'll field those at the end. And it's kind of cool. We've seen people registering from all over the place. So if you want to practice using the chat box, I thought we'd ask a question. Tell us where you're calling in from today. And also if you'd like to tell us how you found out about this, whether it was like Facebook or Maui News or Lahaina News or an email or word of mouth or whatever. So feel free to type in there right now. And yeah, Toba mentioned, I do want to highlight, let's see, our scavenger hunt. So I will post the links in the chat box once I stop sharing my screen to check out the overall event. We have an at a glance page for the event. Oh, some more people are joining us. So we have an at a glance page. You can sign up for the next week's webinar on social science. And we also have our trivia night and I'll drop the link in there too. So that's going to be fun. Toba mentioned that. There's definitely, it's not going to be us trying to teach you a lot of stuff. It's going to be fun, general pub night quiz stuff. And I will put an example question in there, like you might find on Jeopardy, like a before and after. And if anyone wants to take a stab at that, you can do that while I turn it back over to Toba, continue admitting folks. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us. And I'll turn it back over to Toba to introduce our speaker and I will stop sharing my screen. Okay. So watch for those links. And thanks everyone. I'm seeing everyone is telling us where you're from. Pretty cool.
Very cool. Thank you, Liz. It is my distinct pleasure this evening to introduce our speaker, Tara Owens, who I'm sure many of you know as our local rock star here, who's a coastal hazard specialist with the University of Hawaii at Sea Grant. And she's also a liaison to the county in that role. So she partners with the planning department and she plays a role, you know, we see her contributing to the science and the technical guidance to make sure that sound things are happening at the coastline level here. And we've also seen her interface in her role with the state and federal agencies as well to make sure everything is nicely coordinated around those coastal hazards. What you might not know is how Tara, coming from landlocked Tennessee near Chattanooga, got so deeply invested and passionate, as we know she is, about coastal management. So here you've got a picture of 5-year-old Tara. I'm imagining there were probably blonde hair, I'm thinking ringlets, sitting on the beach with her family in an infrequent vacation outing to stay in the South Carolina coast, and her conducting at age 5, her very first beach survey. Well, actually, she was just collecting crabs in a bucket, but recovering from chicken pox, she couldn't get in the water, and that kept her happy for a week. So starting with that passion at a really early age, she was lucky to have parents who helped her figure out how to get into a marine biology program with a university that specialized in that. And it's funny, I can relate to this too, because some of these programs we think of being really commonplace, they weren't necessarily at the time that we were all going to school, so I had the same issue. And from there, at her Coastal Carolina University, within that program, she worked as an undergraduate research assistant to a great professor who inspired her, Dr. Gaze, through 4 years of doing beach surveys all up and down the whole coast there to continue in this field. And then she went on to study here in Hawaii at UH Manoa. And you know, the rest, as we say, is history. Now we have her here as our fabulous and passionate resource, advocating for really solidly backed knowledge behind making our coastal decisions. So I'll turn it over to Tara. Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to share my screen. Can you hear me? You can hear me. Can you see my screen? No? Is that a no, Tova?
Well, does your screen say Zoom? Zoom launch?
No, it's somebody else was sharing their screen, I noticed. Somebody named Nicholas. But I am trying to share my screen.
Oh yeah,
Oh,
let me
yes.
change.
Nicholas Fallows, perhaps stop sharing your screen.
I see a cursor and your meeting has been launched page.
Yeah, that's somebody else's screen.
Okay, I am changing the setting so that one participant can share at a time. Can you try that again, Sarah?
Absolutely. Can you see my screen now?
Okay, yes.
Excellent. Technical barrier overcome. Thank you, Tova, for that very creative introduction. I still don't know how you know that I came from Tennessee. I'll have to find that out one of these days. And thank you everyone for joining tonight. Interestingly, I was told by Tova and Liz, our fearless organizers here, that Facebook rejected the advertisement for this session because it was flagged as a political post, which I thought was interesting. So everybody, welcome to our very own Maui Sea Level Rise Speakeasy.
Yes.
And truly, thanks for coming. It's hard for me. I can't look around the room like I'm used to doing and see who is here with us. So if we haven't met before, please accept my welcome, and always a big welcome back to those of you who are followers and have probably heard a whole lot of this before. And in that case, I hope I don't sound like a broken record and that this is just another update from your friendly neighborhood coastal scientist. I'll start with the image on the screen. I took a really beautifully composed image from Don McLeish and ruined it with all these words. But this is a really good image with a lot of relevant observations to make about West Maui. Starting with, hopefully, can you see my arrow on the screen when I move it around? Yes, you can. Okay. Notice the thin ribbon of sand along the shoreline here, which sort of emphasizes the situation we have here with narrowing beaches and the lack of natural beach buffer between the ocean and our development. Notice in some areas like here, where some of the buildings are set a little bit further back from the coastline, and they have a little bit of a vegetated buffer in front of them before the beach, versus some of these other buildings that are right along the coastline. That reflects changing policies in the field of coastal zone management planning over time. Notice beach loss in front of some of the buildings here that are armored. You can also notice here some water quality impacts that are a reflection of land-based sediment that's getting eroded into the ocean as our beach narrows away and the waves start to eat away at the coastline. And this presentation, the title is very creative, also coming from our organizers here, but it's about how these issues are compelling action in West Maui. So the takeaway for today, hopefully, will be that you're informed about the coastal trends in West Maui and maybe even statewide, and that you're aware, or your attention is brought to the many, many research, planning, and policy initiatives that are sort of already underway. And we'll even get into some of the site-specific and regional responses that are happening in West Maui or being proposed. Okay, so I'll move on. This week, the timing of this Maui News article about rising seas impacting shores and it will only get worse was the timing of this was pretty fortuitous, and it highlighted some of the important takeaways as well. Although it painted a broad brush of the issue, and I'm really happy to be able to have tonight to fill in some more details. And you'll notice another article from the Star Advertiser just this week as well about the Hawaiian Islands seeing nuisance coastal flooding this week due to higher water levels and tides. You may not know, but the National Weather Service has begun issuing coastal flood advisories when our high tides reach a certain threshold. And you'll see, therefore, some of these headlines probably more often these days. And that leads to the next slide, which is a message of, our high tides today are giving us a glimpse of the future. Today's seasonal high tides, or sometimes you hear us refer to them as king tides, are what are going to become tomorrow's everyday or average water level. And the graph you see on the slide here shows you data from our tide gauge in Kahului Harbor just this week.
She's talking.
And you'll notice there's a red line and a blue line. This blue line is NOAA's tide predictions. So you see it goes up and down with the tide every day. We have our highs and our lows. The red line is actually the observed data that's collected at the tide gauge. And what you'll notice is that there's a pretty big difference between the blue line and the red line. That is now consistent across these days. Just some quick math, the high tide on October 19th was something above 8 inches above predicted. So we have an extra 8 inches of water that we weren't expecting. Now, you might have in the past seen this during our king tide season in the summer, during June, July, and August. But this is something we're now seeing consistently across the board for the last couple of years. So it appears to be permanent and is evidence of what is probably a sea level rise acceleration that we're now observing here in Hawaii. And just as a really cool point of interest, you'll see some really weird squiggly lines here on the 19th. That is reflective of the mini tsunami that we just had from an Alaska earthquake that was collected in the data at the tide gauge. Really cool. And as another point of interest related to these higher tides that we're seeing on a regular basis, our program Sea Grant has partnered with the community for the last several years to monitor these king tides through our community photo surveys. And you can contribute to these photo surveys if you go to our web-based photo collection platform, which is here at this website, pacayus.org/KT for king tides. And you can even see the photos that are in our publicly accessible online database. If you go to pacayus.org/KTM for king tide maps, so you can access photos like the ones you see here on the right-hand side. And these, we're using to be able to inform research and decision-making and to monitor these conditions along our coast as time goes on. And now just sort of zooming up to the big picture level here, the 30,000 foot view, so to speak. Here we are, the Hawaiian Islands. We're out here in the middle of the very deep Pacific Ocean. And because of that, I think, as you probably all know, everybody here that lives in an island community is basically a coastal scientist, because we all pay attention to tides and waves and wind and currents. And we know how vulnerable we are to these coastal hazards. We have things like coastal storms and coastal floods and tsunamis and coastal erosion and high tide and high wave flooding. And of course, all of these issues are being magnified by sea level rise. And today we're really going to focus on the issues associated with erosion and high wave and high tide flooding. So that brings us to October this month. In early October, maybe you know, maybe you weren't paying attention, but we had a very early season north swell. These north swells can have a really big impact in West Maui, north as opposed to northwest. If they're northwest swells, they can have an impact in West Maui, but there's a little bit more blocking of that entire wave energy coming in, because we have the islands of Lanai and Molokai sort of shielding us from the full effects. But when we get these north swells, we really see changes in West Maui. And when I saw this image, which was provided to me by a local resident, I was actually fairly shocked. We see events like this, but we don't normally see them as early October. And so I reached out to my group of wave modelers, coworkers that I'm involved with on another project I'll share in a few minutes. And I asked them, what's going on with this swell? And they said, we actually have had only 2 north swell events of this kind of character in early October, only 2 in the last 2 decades. But this may be a harbinger of, what is to come, of course. And you're used to seeing probably images like this in West Maui, where a typical king tide plus combined with a seasonal south swell can lead to overwash on the coastal highway all the way from Ukumehame to Olowalu. And we're seeing conditions like this periodically. This is in Kaanapali, looking toward Pu'ukeka'a, in front of the Kaanapali Beach Hotel. This happened to be a couple of years ago in January, but also an early part of the winter to see these types of conditions where the beach had narrowed so much. And a lot of that section of the shoreline has recovered greatly. So if you go out there today, you will find a nice wide beach again in this area. And as we come into winter season, we will monitor these seasonal changes along our beach as usual. This is looking at the Kahana area in West Maui. So going further north beyond Kaanapali, Kahana is one of our hardest hit areas when it comes to these high wave and erosion signatures that sea level rise is contributing to, along with our land use practices. And you can see in this case, this is a good demonstration of just how vulnerable some of these buildings have become. This is a look at Napili Bay. Last summer, by the end of summer, the summertime erosion had narrowed the beach so much in Napili Bay that there were concerns about this particular resort building that was becoming threatened by erosion. And this is an image in Kauai, which is just actually representative of what has become a very common condition, where we have this area, a couple of miles of the shoreline are armored by seawalls, and it has been this way since the early to mid 1970s when this development was constructed. But now it is very common to find that these structures, these seawalls are failing. So what you see in this image, there's an 8-foot ladder that is poking out of a very large cavity behind the seawall or a sinkhole. And we have probably 40 properties around Maui that have experienced similar, or there have been 40 cases around Maui at different properties of similar circumstances. And some of these sinkholes are becoming recurring problems. So you can see the magnitude of the problem. And here are just some general statistics, statewide and island-wide. 70% of Hawaii shorelines are eroding over the long term, and that's actually higher in Maui. It's 85%. On Maui, our beaches are experiencing the highest rates of erosion compared to Oahu and Kauai. And Maui has the highest percentage of beach loss, and that is actually highest in the West Maui region. And our beaches are now, they have a high seasonal variability. And as the beaches narrow with sea level rise, that ability for the beach to act as our seasonal buffer is diminishing. Now, the historical response to erosion in Hawaii has been to armor the shoreline. You I'm sure are familiar with the many examples, and you've seen some already in these images. And that has led to beach loss and impacts to neighboring properties. So we now know the consequences of that, and armoring the shoreline is now considered a solution of last resort. So this image demonstrates that effect. Here is a property on the left-hand side that was armored with a rock revetment. So the land was preserved in this case, and the beach was lost. The neighboring property right next door, you can see the shoreline continued to migrate landward in the face of sea level rise, but the beach was preserved and the land was lost. And this is what happens. Beaches actually will maintain their presence in the face of sea level rise as long as they have room to migrate landward, and if the geology supports that. And we have varying geology around Hawaii, so that could happen to varying degrees. But you can see that it's very difficult to preserve land and preserve beach at the same time. Now, we get questions about what causes erosion, and we get questions about what can we do. And so we'll talk about both of those things tonight. The contributions to erosion include one being, sea level rise. As water levels come up, it forces our shorelines to move landward and our beaches to narrow. That's this process of long-term or chronic erosion. On top of that, of course, we have our seasonal wave conditions that move sand around up and down the beach and on and off shore. And over time, we see sand loss from that process as well. And we have periodic storms that come through. It could be a big coastal storm like a hurricane or a tropical storm, or it may be a Kona storm that have they're a localized storm with these really short period waves that tend to chew up our coastlines. And that's referred to as episodic erosion. We can have some recovery from those events sometimes. And then finally, the third contribution is the things we humans have done along the way, sometimes in response to erosion. That's the case with with seawalls and revetments, shore parallel structures that are meant to sort of stop the erosion and hold the line and protect the land. And there has also been periodic mining of sand from our beaches around the state through the years that has also contributed. Now we're going to really jump into the sea level rise issue. That's the issue we're taking up tonight. And so I always like to just show what's been happening with respect to our sea levels on Maui. And, as I mentioned before, we have a tide gauge in Kahului Harbor that is there, and it has been measuring our water levels every single day as they go up and down with the tides since the 1940s. So this graphic here on the top right-hand side shows you our tide gauge data from the 1940s onward. You can see the data goes up and down, but generally speaking, the trend is up. And that's been at about a rate of, you know, a 9 inches in 100 years at our tide gauge. And it's interesting, it's a little bit higher, this rate of sea level rise on Maui compared to Oahu and Kauai, because we have this effect of island subsidence, which is depicted here in the image on the bottom. And so that contributes to the higher rates of erosion that we observe on Maui compared to Oahu and Kauai. Then we can talk about what's happening globally and what we can expect for the future. So the image here on the left-hand side is empirical data we've collected from cores and satellites and tide gauges over the last century. And what you can see from that data is that we've seen sea levels rising globally and accelerating. So you can see we started off at 3 inches per century early in the century, that doubled, has doubled yet again, and is continuing to accelerate. And then on the right-hand side, looking into the future, we have projections of sea level rise. And these projections here come from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 5th Assessment Report, which was published quite a few years back. And this was really about the time we were starting in the state of Hawaii to take a look at our sea level rise issues. And at the time, the IPCC was projecting about 3 feet per year, or 3 feet, sorry, by 2100, you know, considering the highest levels of greenhouse gas emissions. Now today, you know, more recent data from NOAA that has been published suggests that we'll see 3 feet of sea level rise at even more intermediate levels of greenhouse gas emissions. So by 2050, we expect to see maybe something with intermediate greenhouse gas scenarios of one feet per year to, you know, 2100, ranging anywhere from 2 feet to 8 feet, with our intermediate projections being 3 feet. And we could feasibly see 4 or 5 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. So these lower level projections are now, we know, not even, you know, realistic, not even something to consider. The question really now is whether we will reach 3 feet by when exactly, 2050, 2060, 2100. And, you know, we know that these sea level rise won't stop there. Greenhouse gas emissions and thermal effects will last, you know, for centuries. So we have to begin to plan ahead. And NOAA even predicts a 10% chance of 6 feet by 2100. So looking at this data, our Hawaii legislature began really taking action in 2014 and beyond. The legislature passed Act 83 in 2014 and built upon that further in 2017 with Act 32, our Hawaii Climate Change Mitigation and Adaptation Initiative. And one of the main products of that was the Hawaii Sea Level Rise Vulnerability and Adaptation Report, which was released in 2017, late 2017, with a recommendation to plan for 3 feet of sea level rise now. And one of the spinoffs of that was the Hawaii Sea Level Rise Viewer, which I hope many of you are already familiar with, but if you aren't, you will be now. And you can go in this Sea Level Rise Viewer, zoom into any location statewide, and look at the projected exposure to sea level rise at various thresholds, 1/2 foot, 1 foot, 2 feet, and 3 feet of sea level rise. And the sea level rise report and viewer have really provided a tangible basis for the planning and policy discussions that are being had statewide now, and in particular here in Maui County. So we've passed beyond this barrier of data limitations, where before we may not have had good planning level data, we now do. And because of that, we're really transitioning to the realm of these very difficult conversations about how to plan for sea level rise that are social, cultural, and financial in nature. And it takes a while to turn the ship, but the ship is turning. So there's a lot going on. At the state level, I stole this slide from our state sustainability officer at the Office of Planning. And she was showing here how we have the Hawaii sea level rise report. And now that sea level rise report and the information from it is being integrated into many different planning exercises. The state of Hawaii hazard mitigation plan. There was a report by the Office of Planning on managed retreat strategies. There was recently a statewide coastal highway program report that included this new information on sea level rise. And then at the county level, there is also countywide integration of this information into various planning activities, including our general plan and community plans. The planning department and the county council are working on those things. There are now vulnerability assessments to sea level rise being done at all the departments countywide. This information is included in our recent County of Maui Hazard Mitigation Plan update, which is just now being adopted. And one of the big things too, from a policy perspective, is that this data is being considered as the basis for updating the Maui shoreline rules and its setbacks. And I'll mention that again in a few minutes. So now what we have with this sea level rise viewer is we have a really good parcel level, information about sea level rise and how it will affect us in 3 different ways. There are 3 models that are put together to compose what's referred to as the sea level rise exposure area. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these models, but it's passive flooding, high wave flooding, and coastal erosion. And before I get into the models specifically, I just thought I'd share some quick data for West Maui specifically. So this sea level rise exposure area was analyzed for West Maui. And so here's some quick statistics of what will be affected in the 1 foot level sea level rise exposure area and the 3 foot level sea level rise exposure area, including acreage, numbers of buildings, what's in the urban district, what's in the growth boundaries, or what part of the growth boundaries are in the SLR-XA, how many miles of state highway, how many miles of road in total, considering state, county, and private roads, and the economic value of the land and buildings within those sea level rise exposure zones, or the SLR-XA. And just to put that into perspective, you can compare that also to all of our other community plan areas on Maui. And you can see that West Maui is in terms of economic loss and value of structures and land, is double what we see in the next highest area, which is Kihei and McKenna. So we do have some concerns, I'll put it that way, in West Maui. Now, getting back to the models, we have these 3 ways that sea level rise affects us. The first model is called passive flooding, or you consider this still water or high tide flooding. So that has been modeled, and we're looking at an example here from the Ukumehame area. And as you guys probably know, when there's a rain event in Ukumehame, we get flooding like you see in the image on the right-hand side there of these low-lying areas. And so these are areas where as sea level rises, the tide comes up and it might flood the land from the ocean side, or because these are such low elevation areas, we might have water coming up through the groundwater intrusion. So existing wetlands will expand, and we may have new emerging wetlands in places like this. And so you can start to see where that will occur. The second way that sea level rise affects us is when you combine, and this is a real biggie for West Maui, when you combine high tides with our seasonal high waves, which in West Maui can be from the south in the summertime and from the north in the wintertime, or the northwest. And so again, we're looking at the Ukamehame region, and you can see areas where we'll have a high wave flooding coming over the highway at many places in West Maui in the future with 3 feet of sea level rise. And of course, we are already starting to see that in certain areas like mile marker 14 here at Olowalu. Now, as it relates to waves, before we get into the erosion issue, I want to bring your attention to a very focused research project that is ongoing and wrapping up. Because of these vulnerabilities in West Maui and these known issues, we've been building a special wave model for West Maui to look at wave impacts. And I'm going to run out of time, so I'm going to speed through some of these things. But the bathymetry within West Maui, the complex seafloor depths and in the Maui Nui complex really affect or change the way waves interact with our coast. And so you can see wave energy coming into our coast from a north swell and West Maui, and here from a south swell. We have modeled that. This is a research team, which is a combined effort between Oceanography, JIMAR, the Joint Institute for Marine and Atmospheric Research, those are within SOAST, and the Pacific Islands Ocean Observing System, and Sea Grant. And this is a real quick sneak peek, but in the very near future, we are going to be sharing this with the community. And what we will have is essentially a wave forecast for West Maui, like kind of like a weather forecast for waves. And so 6 days in advance, we'll be able to predict where we might have high wave run up and high wave impacts in West Maui. And we've divided the coastline into 12 areas based on their characteristics. So when this is live and running, you can roll over any one of these areas. Like in this image here, we're looking at Napili, and you would be able to look at the predicted wave run up for the Napili area in the coming days and the past few days. And we're looking at when waves reach these zones that you can see here in red, that is when we start to observe impacts in West Maui. And we know that because the community has been helping us validate that model over the past few years by using our photo collection platform and submitting images like this when we have high wave events that have been helping us to curate this database and tweak the wave model. So this is something that is coming soon, and we'll be happy to share more with you in the very near future. Look out for that. And finally, the third way that sea level rise affects us is not by flooding from high tides and high waves, but by actual land loss, coastal erosion. And so there's a third model that projects land loss with these at these 3 different sea level rise thresholds, 1 foot, 2 foot, and 3 foot. And so that is represented by these colored lines along the shoreline. So this red line here represents projected erosion with 3 feet of sea level rise. And it essentially effectively means that we have 80% confidence that we will be safe from erosion landward of this line. And of course, you've already seen the images. We know we have erosion issues. The next question we get from folks, so what is causing this? Now, what can we do about it? Aside from the high level, planning and policy items that I highlighted already, there are, the property specific and the regional specific things that are happening. So this represents sort of the coastal management toolbox with a spectrum of tools in the toolbox. From what do? We could do nothing, which would be, letting buildings and roads fall into the ocean, which obviously is not ideal. To the other end of the spectrum, which would be to armor the shoreline with seawalls and revetments. And we mentioned that earlier as a sort of a solution of last resorts because of the consequences. To these things in between that, are the preferred strategies from a coastal zone management perspective. And I don't have time to talk in detail about all of these things, but I want to mention two things because these are very relevant to topics that are being discussed on Maui and specifically in West Maui. So one is managed retreat in the form of shoreline development setbacks. And the other is beach restoration. So I will focus on those two items before I wrap up. You should know on Maui, we currently have, and we were the first county to have setbacks that are based in science. And they are currently based on erosion rates. So the higher your erosion rate in front of your property, the larger your development setback is currently. And the Maui County Planning Commission administers those rules. That policy, though, is based on maps of erosion that we have that look at the past. And they aren't factoring in these future conditions that we're already seeing and expect to worsen in the coming future. So the planning department has proposed an update to that policy that would be based on the erosion projections I just showed you in the sea level rise viewer. So there's this red erosion hazard line. And the county is proposing to base the setback now on, it would be this erosion hazard line plus an additional 40 feet would be your property setback in places where we have these erosion projections. And then there's an alternate B for areas where we do not have these erosion projections. So this is something to look out for. There was a series of public meetings late last year about this proposed setback update, among many other things. And I think this will be coming up again in the future, in the near future, with the community. And then finally, I wanted to mention 3 beach restoration initiatives that are proposed and being discussed in our community. One for Kahana Bay. So some of those pictures I showed earlier of the condominiums in Kahana that are very close to the shoreline and being affected by waves and erosion. The second is Kaanapali, and the third is Napili Bay. Each of these are proposed projects. Kahana and Kaanapali would be larger regional scale projects. Napili Bay would be a much smaller scale beach restoration project. And I don't have time. We could spend an hour on each of these projects, but I have some quick statistics that address the most frequently asked questions you see here about scope, sand source, economic impacts, environmental studies, funding, and timeline. So for each of these projects, here you see the Kahana area again. And for Kahana, we have some statistics. I can share these slides with Liz and Tova, and they can distribute them to all of you if you're interested in these details or want to follow up with questions. At Kahana, the scope of the project is to potentially restore the 1975 beach footprint using 50 to 100,000 cubic yards of sand and some possible groin structures along the shoreline. They're working on their draft EIS as we speak. And when that is released, there will be a chance for public comment. And And this is a conceptual diagram of what might be proposed at Kahana among other alternatives. This is a look at recent conditions along Kaanapali Beach. This is standing in front of the Marriott, so you can see the very narrow beach and the degraded conditions there. Many of you may know Kaanapali is also pursuing a beach restoration project. And I should say, in each of these cases, the sand for these projects has been identified offshore, and that sand would be one way or another be brought back to the shoreline to restore conditions that meet, like a previous historic condition of the beach. In Kaanapali's case, it would be the 1988 beach footprint with about 75,000 cubic yards of sand to increase the dry beach width on average by 42 feet. Kaanapali has recently released their draft environmental impact statement. There was a recent public meeting in September, and there are, I think, smaller community meetings ongoing with future public hearings to come. So you always have the opportunity as a member of the public to learn more about these projects and weigh in if you have questions or concerns. And then finally at Napili, I showed this image earlier. You can understand the conditions there with narrowing beach. Luckily, there haven't been any major issues yet with structures affected. And so the Napili Bay and Beach Foundation, which is a nonprofit group, has been working for the last couple of years to do the studies that are necessary to potentially restore beach there. And they're looking at a much smaller project, something like 10,000 to 20,000 cubic yards, increasing the dry beach width by about 20 feet. And they are currently finishing up their technical studies. And there is a programmatic EA at the state called Small Scale Beach Restoration Program that would allow this project to go forward. And they are currently seeking private funds to pursue that project in the future. And I know that was a long presentation, and yet just scratching the surface of everything that's happening in West Maui and beyond. So I'll stop there. We will share slides. We can take questions now, and you can always contact me later on for questions as well. And I can connect you with representatives of these various projects if you have other questions that I shouldn't or can't answer. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tara. That was so fascinating, also disturbing. So it looks like we do have a few questions, and I'll invite anyone who still has a question they'd like to ask to type that into the chat box, and we have time. All right, so the first question, Robin wanted to hear a few words about South Maui. I don't know what you'd like to share, or if Robin, you wanted to turn on your mic, turn off your mute, and add any details.
It's just everything I have seen, and thank you, Tara. I've been through this presentation or related with you over the past several years. And I saw a figure of a lot of economic impact on Kihei, but I don't think I've ever heard much about what's going on, what the problems are in Kihei. Can you tell us anything about, in a minute or two about South Maui?
Well, right. I'm focusing on West Maui here, obviously, and its relationship to the Ridge to Reef, West Maui Ridge to Reef project. But of course, the other parts of the island, the North Shore and South Maui, are not immune from these issues either. There are similar erosion trends, and there are erosion hotspots in those areas too that we could talk about for a long time. In South Maui, some of the erosion hotspots are, along South Kihei Road in the north part of the region. And we also have some pretty serious issues at Halama Street, north of Kalama Beach Park. And similar to Oahu and Kauai, we have a lot of shoreline armoring there, and that shoreline armoring is starting to fail in some of those cases. But then in other areas in South Maui, going further south toward Wailea, Keawakapu, Wailea, McKenna, we do have fairly healthy, nice, wide beach systems. And we have a sustained program of dune restoration in those areas. So we're trying to be proactive to keep those beaches and dune systems healthy over time. And that's South Maui in a nutshell. But Robin, we could always have more detailed discussions of the issues and solutions in South Maui as well.
Great, thanks, Tara. Another question is from Mark, and he's asking, the PAC-IOS viewer is for long-term planning, and there's a 10% likelihood of 6-foot sea level rise by 2100. Should there not be a 6-foot model checkbox for decision guidance?
Good question. Good question. When the state set out, embarked on developing the sea level rise report and the viewer, we were relying on that, the last IPCC 5th assessment report, which had us looking at 3 feet of sea level rise by 2100. Of course, as I mentioned, the science has come along quite a bit since then. And we now know that may very well be a conservative estimate. So yes, we probably do need to start looking ahead at higher thresholds for sea level rise, in particular for things like critical infrastructure that are going to be around for a long time and may not be very risk tolerant. We need them to survive, like wastewater pump stations and roads, things like that. There is a data layer for 6 feet that comes from NOAA. And the state is talking about adding that to our sea level rise viewer. However, it is based on the passive flooding or high tide flooding only. So for a place like West Maui, it really, really underestimates the hazards. And I think we do need to do the same modeling that we have right now for 3 feet of sea level rise. And that is being discussed. UH is responsible for all the good modeling we have, and it could be done. It could be done for some of these higher sea level rise thresholds as well.
Great. Another question, how would managed retreat work for a mature development like Kaanapali Beach?
That is the $1 million question. You know how I mentioned earlier, if you caught it, we are really transitioning now from the conversations we had over the last 10 years about what will sea level rise look like? What is our exposure? We need data, we've got a model. Well, we've done that. And we'll always need up-to-date data, and we'll always need to continue modeling. But what we have is cutting edge, and it is now really providing this basis for the really, really difficult conversations and planning decisions that have to be made. I don't know that anybody in the state or in the nation really knows how to effectuate retreat. And especially in a place like Hawaii, where our coastal development is so valuable. You know, in mainland places, retreat, especially it happens very frequently in like flood zones where there are repetitive loss of structures to floods. There are community buyouts where properties are purchased and homeowners are given incentive to relocate. Those kind of programs don't work in places like Hawaii where the property values are so high. You know, I guess I'll have to leave it there. We don't know the answers to those questions yet. And the community plays a big role in contributing to that conversation and working with your leaders and decision makers on trying to set policies and plans and visions for how to do this going forward.
Great. Let's see. Someone asked, has the viewer been modified or updated yet for differences in substrate as the coast erodes?
Good question. Okay, so we have this projection of erosion, this erosion model with sea level rise in the future. And one of the underlying assumptions of that model is that the geology will remain consistent, you know, as the shoreline moves in the landward direction. However, we know that the geology isn't always consistent around Maui. This question came up really frequently when the County of Maui went through the process of community meetings late last year relating to that proposed shoreline setback update. And so one thing that the county requested from UH through the Coastal Geology Group, that's the group that operates under Chip Fletcher that has developed these models, was to take a second look at the geology and try to flag any areas where the model, the assumption in the model might not hold up. I can tell you that that exercise has been done, and the results are being looked at right now. It turns out there are very few places where we transition from beach or soft sediments like these alluvial land-based sediments we find in West Maui. There are very few places where we actually hit, you know, hard substrate like volcanic rock, and where the shorelines won't continue to erode. But those areas will be flagged, and so that is coming soon. Thank you for that question.
Great. Okay, and we have one from Rita. What is the most urgent action Maui County must take to adapt or to mitigate the effects of sea level rise?
I'm sorry, Liz, can you repeat that? I missed that.
Sure. What is the most urgent action Maui County must take to adapt to or mitigate the effects of sea level rise?
What is the most urgent action? Rita, that's a really tough question. It probably depends on your perspective. I will say, you know, the county's been working really hard on that new proposed policy for shoreline setbacks. And that would really go a long way to make sure that any new development or redevelopment is being sited out of harm's way. I think that would be a big step forward. It doesn't, as the previous questioner asked, really help us with all the existing development and how do we get that out of the way in the future? But at least gets us moving forward and kind of with the philosophy of do no further harm. So that is one policy that I think would be really important right now.
Great. And we have 2 minutes until 6, and if people want to stick around, that's fine. But and I can talk more about the event in general in a minute. But I wanted to turn it back over to Toba, who had a question she wanted to ask that sort of ties into a question I just saw appear in the chat box as well. So I'll back to you, Toba.
Okay, thanks. Great talk, Tara. And I think it's okay. Those of us who have heard different versions before are happy to hear a new version because it's dense and involved. So your role, of course, is to make sure that there's sound information slotting into those conversations about planning and decision making. What have you found to be the compelling messages to actually have people change their perspective and get around the fact that the seas are moving in one direction and it's happening quickly? We all know that having the science isn't enough. Having the communication strategy has to be part of that. So any nuggets there and what's worked?
Yeah, I mean, we've come a long way in 10 years. I've been in this role now for almost 11 years. And I remember having conversations when I started in this role 10, 11 years ago about, you know, disbelief in climate change and sea level rise. And for the most part, that is no longer the case. You know, our leaders and decision makers at the state level and at the county level have been very responsive. I think the the form of communication that seems to always work for me is just to show the impacts that are already occurring on our island. You know, I always start off with a series of photographs because that's not something that you can ignore. And people who are residents here, for sure, they know that the conditions have changed, and they can see that through their own observations. And then certainly when I am able to sort of to show them the worst case, you know, the worst cases that we're faced with. So that's been a powerful communication tool.
Good answer. Thanks.
Okay, well, it seems like we've hit the 6 o'clock mark, and I want to thank everyone for joining us. I want to thank Tara for a fantastic presentation. If anyone wants to stick around a minute or two more, I can tell you more about our scavenger hunt and our trivia night coming up, as well as I just posted the link to register for next week's talk, which is about ocean stewardship. And we have a PhD student from Stanford who worked with the team from the Nature Conservancy and Polonui Hugh to do a really interesting study. So we hope you folks will join us next week as well. If you've been to the Ridge to Reef Rendezvous in the past years, we know that we have this great Hui tent and all the partners are there. And we have a little scavenger hunt booklet so people can learn and take some time to spend with all the partners. And we put that online this time. So it takes the form of an online kind of quiz, and it's easy to do. I will post the link in there right now. And basically all you have to do is tell us what you did, tell us what you learned. If you've been following along on our Facebook and all the social media channels of West Maui CP and our partners, for the whole month and through the end of the month, we're featuring all these groups and their awesome work in West Maui for 2 days each. So you can go back through all the feeds and look up some great information. It's been really cool to see what everyone's doing and to share that. So we kind of we do absolutely miss seeing you all in person this year for the event, but this is what we did instead. And also know that every year we give out thousands of dollars of prizes and we get donations from our local businesses. And this year we did not want to ask the local businesses who are struggling. So instead we're purchasing gift cards and we'll be giving those out in a random drawing for anyone who enters the scavenger hunt. So it's fun, it's not difficult. We have a checkbox of all these actions you can do. And next Friday, trivia night, that's going to be fun. And did anyone write in the answer to our question? I put in an example, Disney Plus ? It's like before and after from Jeopardy. The clue was Mufasa, Shakespeare. Anyone? Let me see if you can think of that. So that's an example of some fun stuff that we're going to be doing, as well as some Ridge to Reef related theme things. So I'll post in some of the links and we will be in touch, and make sure you check us out online, get involved. We're going to be doing all this stuff through the end of the month, and it's been great seeing you all as little squares. Tova, anything you want to add or?
No, I just copy all that. And thank you so much for the talk, Tara. And thank you all, even just seeing your names, your faces are even better, but your names, warms my heart missing you all this month from our usual events. So have a good evening and we hope to see you next week. Bye.
Bye, everyone. I'll leave the chat box open a little bit longer if anyone wants to say hi. And no one guessed it. No one guessed it.
It was too hard, Liz.
Mufasa and Shakespeare. Oh, come on. It's not that hard.
I don't even know what you're talking about.
So it's a before and after. Mufasa, it says Disney Plus. It's like before and after from Jeopardy, where you take the first part and the second part and make something new. Mufasa, Shakespeare. Okay. Anyone? Feel free to turn on your mic.
Yes, turn on your mic.
I'm going to tell you the answer.
No idea.
It's Lion King Lear. Get it? Mufasa from Lion King. Shakespeare.
Okay. Okay, I've never
Right?
seen
Lion
Jeopardy, so I
King,
think I didn't get it.
King
Yeah.
Lear. All right. We'll have other ones. There will be Family Guy references and other things that are marginally inappropriate, as you'd expect from me, but still okay if a kid were to wander into the room, I think. And I did pick up quite a few gift cards from Kohola Brewery yesterday, so we are giving out good prizes. So we hope you guys will form some teams, recruit some folks. You don't have to be Maui based to do it. The prizes are Maui based, so that might present a challenge, but we'll deal with that later. So yeah, it was great to see you all. Thanks again for joining us. Hopefully see you next week.